Hey there again, this is Mr. Hefner, and this is part two of Meet the Killer Angels as part of the introduction to our Killer Angels unit by Michael Shaara. We're going to take a look today at who the Confederate characters are in the novel. So let's get started. First thing I want to kind of take a look at, just like when we started with the Union characters, I showed you the Union flag at the time. I want to clear up a little bit of a, not necessarily a controversy, but a confusion about this thing called the Confederate flag. You see an image in front of you right now, and a lot of people will fly that and they'll say it's not a racist symbol, it's just a symbol of their heritage. And I'd like to clear up some of the problem by helping them out with their misreading of history. This is not, repeat, this is not the Confederate flag. This is something called the Confederate naval jack. So this particular flag in a rectangular shape with the St. Andrew's cross and the 13 stars like this would have flown only on Confederate naval ships. And for a time it was also carried by the Army of Tennessee. Not the Army of the Tennessee, that was a Union Army, but the Army of Tennessee was a Confederate Army. And so this was never the national flag of the Confederacy. So sorry, folks. So part of the problem is today we make a lot of flags in a rectangular shape, and that's the way the flag companies are set up. But what if this was square? So let's take a look at it in its square shape. So what about this? Is this then the Confederate flag? And the answer once again is no, it's not the Confederate flag. In a square shape like this, with the St. Andrew's cross and the 13 stars, this would have been the flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. So this was the flag which was carried into battle by Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army. So I suppose if somebody has an ancestor that fought with the Army of Northern Virginia, that person might be able to argue that this flag is heritage. But for most people, this flag is not going to be heritage. So then what was the Confederate flag? Certainly that country must have had a flag, and in fact they did. They had 3 of them. So the first one was the one they flew at the start of the war. It had 7 stars, which represented the original 7 Confederate states to secede, and then it had red and white stripes. And if you look at it, it probably reminds you of something. It looks almost like a Betsy Ross flag, just without 13 stripes, with 10 fewer stripes on it. The problem with this flag was exactly that. On the battlefield, it often got confused for the American flag. And so shortly after this flag was adopted, the Confederate States adopted a second flag. And now this one here, remember we talked about that part of the flag in the upper left-hand corner close to the flagpole, that is called the canton. This flag now has the St. Andrew's cross. Now, that St. Andrew's cross is the same cross that you see in the British Union Jack. If you can picture a British flag, you might recall there are 2 crosses. There's one which is perpendicular and horizontal lines. That is the cross of St. George. And then this one here, which is more like an X shape, and this is the cross of St. Andrew. On the British Union Jack, St. George is the patron saint of England, St. Andrew the patron saint of Scotland, and when those 2 countries were formed into one, they combined the 2 crosses. A lot of aristocracy in the South traces their history back to those same northern British Isles, and so they used the Confederate cross. It has 13 stripes because more Confederate states eventually joined the original 7. And then it has just this large white field. So because of that large white field, this was called the stainless banner. And this was the official Confederate national flag. The problem, of course, is when the wind isn't blowing and this flag is flying on a battlefield, you often can't see the canton. And so it looked like a flag of surrender, which it wasn't supposed to be. So that had to be fixed, and that was going to be fixed with what was called the 3rd national flag of the Confederacy. And it's the same as the stainless banner. The only difference is they added that red stripe down the outer edge of the flag so that if the wind weren't blowing, you would see red and white on the pole instead of just simply white. Unfortunately for the Confederacy, this flag was not adopted by the Confederate Congress until 1865, and just 1 month before the end of the war. So while these flags might have been in production I'm sure that very few of them ever made it into use in the amount of time that was left. All right, so let's get to our characters for this part of the novel, well, for the representing the Confederacy. The first, of course, is going to be Robert E. Lee. Everybody knows that name. You've seen the controversies in recent years about whether or not statues to Robert E. Lee should be taken down or left up, and many of them have been, in fact, taken down. There's controversy over slavery. Michael Shaara says at the beginning of the book that Robert E. Lee did not believe in slavery and did not own slaves. That is not true. Robert E. Lee's family had slaves. He inherited them. And there are actually slave accounts of the fact that Robert E. Lee himself inflicted harsh punishments on them for any sort of infractions or misbehaviors. So what about this Robert E. Lee guy? Why does he have such a big name? Why is he so respected in the South? Well, first of all, he was the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, which was the largest army that was fighting for the Confederacy. It's funny, it was called the Army of Northern Virginia, and that's a Confederate army. And at the beginning of the war, the Army of Northern Virginia fought the Army of Virginia, which was a Union or a Northern army. That army later reformed and changed its name to the Army of the Potomac. Robert E. Lee was such an impressive commander. In fact, he led the Marines, which went into Harper's Ferry and put down John Brown's raid before the Civil War even started. But he had such a great reputation that he was offered command of the entire Union or Northern Army at the start of the war. And Robert E. Lee, of course, being a Virginian, realized he could not bring war, not an offensive war anyway, into his homeland of Virginia. He couldn't just simply turn down that, and so he had little option other than to resign his command in the Union Army. He was not immediately promoted to command an army in the South. He did other duties first, helping with supplies and things like that, and served under Joseph Johnston. And when Johnston was wounded in the Peninsula Campaign, that is when Robert E. Lee is going to get his promotion and take over in that command. Now, Robert E. Lee comes from a long family of Virginians. One quick little thing here. I should have mentioned this here. His reputation at West Point, when he was training at West Point, was that to this day, he's the only cadet who received no demerits in his entire time at West Point. Demerits are sort of like points off if you do something wrong, and that doing something wrong could be as little as forgetting to square your corners when you're walking around campus, or forgetting to salute someone, or not doing your laundry in the proper way. He was trained to be an engineer, and that's really important in the Army because it's all about calculating distances, making maps, figuring out how far you can get over different types of terrain, calculating trajectories of projectiles from cannons and mortars and things like that. So mathematics was really key to doing well in the Army. But let me get back to this, his being a staunch Virginian. Virginia was his home state. Virginia was everything to him. And he has a lot of connections with some other famous Virginians. For instance, his father, whose name was Light Horse Harry Lee, it was actually Henry, but his nickname was Light Horse Harry, was a lieutenant general to George Washington. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, but when George Washington died, a eulogy was given, and that eulogy described George Washington by saying he was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Those words were composed by Robert E. Lee's father, Light Horse Harry Lee. And then Robert E. Lee has two uncles who signed the Declaration of Independence. One of them was Francis Lightfoot Lee, and the other one is really important, Richard Henry Lee. And Richard Henry Lee was the member of the Continental Congress who first introduced a bill for independence that ultimately led to the writing of the Declaration of Independence. So he is a very, very important Virginian. But there's one more Virginian that he has a strong connection to. We'll do that. We'll talk about that by taking a look at Robert E. Lee's house. So this is Arlington House. It's the house that Robert E. Lee and his wife, Mary, lived in at the start of the war. It's just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. Now, he didn't build this house, he inherited it through marriage. And this is going to get a little confusing, so bear with me for a second. But if we go all the way back to George Washington never had children of his own. And when he married a widow who had a child from a previous marriage. That was Martha Custis. And Martha Custis's daughter had two children. So George Washington basically had two step-grandchildren. And when the daughter died, George Washington and Martha Washington raised their grandchildren, his step-grandchildren, her grandchildren, raised them as if they were their own children. Well, the boy who was raised by George Washington, a step-grandson raised as a son, was named George Washington Parke Custis. That's a lot of names, I know. George Washington Parke Custis had a daughter named Mary Anna Custis, and she was a distant cousin to Robert E. Lee, and she became Robert E. Lee's wife. So through marriage, Robert E. Lee has a connection going all the way back to George Washington. Now, George Washington Parke Custis wanted to honor the man who basically raised him, and so he built this building, Arlington House, in the early 1800s, and he filled it with all kinds of mementos and tributes to George Washington. When George Washington Parke Custis died, it went to his daughter and, of course, to his daughter's husband, and so this became Robert E. Lee's house. This is Arlington House. Now, for whatever, I don't even want to interpret why, but at the start of the war, Robert E. Lee was off fighting the war. Mary Anna Custis Lee was living in the house, and Union soldiers started burying their dead in the yard here at Arlington House. She fled the house. The house was basically abandoned for the war, and their property became a cemetery. After the war was over, descendants of the Lees gave the property to the federal government, and it already had Union dead buried there. This is what became Arlington National Cemetery. So everybody's familiar with Arlington National Cemetery. It's one of the highest places of honor that Americans can be buried, especially military Americans. It's where the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is. That was once Robert E. Lee's land, but it was confiscated by Union soldiers at the beginning of the war. Later on, it was given back to the Lees. It was full of Union dead, and so the descendants of the Lees gave it to the United States government, and that is now Arlington Cemetery. So, interesting story. Won't really affect your interpretation of the Killer Angels too much, but I wanted you to know. Now, Robert E. Lee's right-hand man, by the time we get to Gettysburg, is Lieutenant General James Longstreet. Now, Longstreet is portrayed in the novel as being a dark and moody kind of fellow. He used to gamble and hang out with his men, and now he prefers to stay alone. And you know from the novel, or you will know from the novel, that recently, it was actually a year earlier, three of his four children died of scarlet fever. And he's been off fighting the war, and he's only been able to communicate through letters and things like that. Longstreet is an interesting kind of misfit in the novel, and look for examples of how he doesn't fit in. Everybody on the Confederate side, when you're reading The Killer Angels, is Virginia, Virginia, Virginia. That's all they talk about. And here's Longstreet commanding all these Virginians, but he's a South Carolinian who spent most of his life actually in Georgia, not Virginia. That makes him a little bit of an outsider at a time when states and states' rights are the big cry. He also has some connections to the North. He was a roommate of none other than Ulysses Grant when he was a student at West Point, became a really good friend. Ulysses Grant actually married a cousin of James Longstreet, and Longstreet was the best man at Julia Grant and Ulysses Grant's wedding. Longstreet is going to command at Gettysburg the 1st Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, just before Gettysburg, there were only two corps in Lee's army. The Second Corps has now been divided into two more. So Longstreet still has the largest corps. And like I said, he's not a Virginian. Keep your eye on that. One of the other things to keep your eye on as you read this novel is he's portrayed as a defensive strategist. There is no question at the time of the Civil War, if you could dig in, build fortifications, and let your enemy attack you, you had a better chance than if you were attacking a fortification. And so at Gettysburg, Longstreet doesn't want to fight. He realizes the Union Army has the best ground. He wants to get the Confederate Army around the Union Army, put it between the Union Army and Washington, D.C., thereby threatening Washington, D.C., and possibly get surrender terms on the table. But he's arguing throughout the novel with Robert E. Lee. Now, this is that person versus person type of conflict, all right? People argue all the time. But this isn't an argument between two people who hate one another and disagree. This is a disagreement between two people who have incredible respect for one another. Longstreet respects Lee, and Lee respects Longstreet. And so it makes for a very interesting conflict as you read this novel. Now, Longstreet, we mentioned, is given to these fits of depression, goes off to himself. That gives him a chance sometimes to act as a foil to other characters, as he has private conversations with Robert E. Lee, and he's going to have private conversations with Louis Armistead. So keep your eye on that. Robert E. Lee called him my old war horse. He could always count on Longstreet. And Longstreet was always there, up until about a year later. 1 year later, at the Battle of the Wilderness, Longstreet is going to be accidentally wounded by some of his own men. He's going to not lose his arm, but he's going to lose the nerves in one of his arms, so it's going to just kind of hang limply at his side for the rest of his life. His throat's going to be wounded. His voice is going to be reduced to a whisper for the rest of his life. And after the war is over, this doesn't affect your reading of The Killer Angels, but after the war is over, Longstreet is going to be one of the first Confederates to swear an oath of allegiance to the North. He's going to become a Republican, which is the party of Abraham Lincoln, or was the party of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln has been assassinated by that point. And because his good friend, Ulysses Grant, becomes President of the United States, Longstreet is going to get a government position. I think he becomes like minister to the Ottoman Empire or something like that. But this is going to change the way the South sees James Longstreet after the war. So Longstreet stayed with Lee through the whole war. He followed, I don't know of any instance where he intentionally disobeyed a command. He may have disagreed. But then after the war, he was very quick to join up with the North and take a position. The other thing he did was he wrote a well-read book called From Manassas to Appomattox. That title means From the First Battle of the War to the Last Battle of the War. And in that book, he openly criticized Robert E. Lee for his strategies at Gettysburg. That's going to hurt Longstreet's reputation in the South for many, many years. And it's one of the ways that Michael Shaara is going to portray Longstreet in this book as being in that conflict against Robert E. Lee. Now, here's a character in the book who's not in the book. How can I say that? Well, he's dead by the time we get to the Battle of Gettysburg, but his shadow hangs over everything. And in fact, he's one of the first characters that gets talked about in the entire novel. This is Lieutenant Thomas J. or Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was an interesting kind of guy. Before the war, he taught at the Virginia Military Institute, and funny little story, he used to memorize his speeches and his lessons, and he would deliver his lessons to his students word for word. And if he lost his place, if he forgot a sentence, instead of looking at his notes, he simply started the whole lesson over again. His students quickly learned, never ask a question, never interrupt, because we'll have to sit through this whole thing again. Well, when the war came along, he resigned his position at the Virginia Military Academy, and he signed up for the Army, rose to the rank of Lieutenant General. And he had only in his entire time as a commander, he had only one battle loss as an independent commander. We'll get to that a little bit later. But just a little over a month before the Battle of Gettysburg, he fought his greatest battle, the Battle of Chancellorsville. And in the Battle of Chancellorsville, we won't go into everything, but the Confederate Army really didn't have a chance of winning. And yet, through some brilliant strategies by Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, they were able to win that battle. Now, the one thing that in retrospect seems to be a mistake is on the last night, Jackson was with some men scouting out some territory in the dark. They stumbled upon some of their own men who opened fire. And Jackson was wounded by his own men, hit several times, had to have his arm amputated. He was recovering from the amputation of the arm when infection set in. He developed pneumonia and he died. And so there's this famous saying that Robert E. Lee, when he learned of the death of the commander of his Second Corps, who he counted on so much, that Robert E. Lee said, "Jackson has lost his left arm, I have lost my right arm." Well, that was probably before he lost Jackson altogether. But Jackson's corps is going to be divided into two corps, one commanded by A.P. Hill and the other commanded by Richard Ewell, and we'll talk about those in just a little bit as well. So two corps from one. But look how many times in this novel somebody mentions Stonewall Jackson. By the way, I think it was back in 2008, I was down in the area of the Battle of the Wilderness, and I went out to, there's a farm there, and you can go out in the middle of the cornfield, and there's a tombstone, and I don't know if you can read it on the slide, but that is where the arm of Stonewall Jackson is buried. So somebody actually put up a marker in that location. Jackson himself is buried in Lexington, Virginia, but his arm is buried right here near the Battle of the Wilderness. Now, Richard Ewell, let's talk about him. Richard Ewell is going to get the Second Corps, which is one of the two corps which is formed from Stonewall Jackson's old corps. Richard Ewell was a student of Stonewall Jackson. He studied under him. He knows the Jackson way, and Robert E. Lee believes he can trust him as he trusted Stonewall Jackson. The problem is, Richard Ewell is not Stonewall Jackson. His men, by the way, his nickname is Old Baldhead or Old Baldy. You'll see that show up from time to time. Richard Ewell is a changed man. Number one, he's recently found religion. That's going to change his attitudes towards killing and fighting and mercy and things like that. The other thing is he's recently gotten married. Married men might have something to live for that single men don't. And he's also just returned from having his own leg amputated. So I guess once you get wounded badly like that the first time, you might be a little more cautious after that. And so even though he was a protege or a student of Stonewall Jackson, he ended up being a lot more cautious. And one of the biggest controversies about the Battle of Gettysburg, which is going to play up in the book you're reading, is during the first day's battle, there is a high piece of ground called Cemetery Hill. Union troops are already on that hill thanks to John Buford. But a very cryptic order comes from Robert E. Lee to Richard S. Ewell that says, "I want you to take that hill if practicable." In other words, this is what's called a discretionary order. You use your best discretion. You decide, can I do this or not? And at the end of the day's fighting, Ewell's troops were tired. More Union troops had dug in on that hill, and he simply decided, we can't take that hill. And he gets blamed for that. A lot of people to this day still believe that if Ewell had taken that hill, the Confederates would have won the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, the second part of Jackson's old corps, which is now the Third Corps of the Army of Virginia, is being commanded by General Ambrose Powell Hill. It's kind of funny, you know. We talk about taking down statues to Confederate soldiers, but one of the United States' larger army bases is Fort A.P. Hill in Virginia. So we have an army base named after a Confederate soldier. Actually, several of them, but anyway, he's going to command the First Corps that's going to arrive at Gettysburg. Henry Heath, that guy who went in and started the whole fighting, is commanded by A.P. Hill. A.P. Hill is a little bit, I don't want to use the word odd. Let's say eccentric. That's a nice word for odd. One of the things his men noticed about him early on was that if there was going to be a battle, he put on a red shirt with his uniform. He wore a white shirt or a natural colored shirt any other day. But if there was going to be a battle, he put on this red shirt. It was his battle shirt. And A.P. Hill is not of the upper social class. And so he doesn't quite fit in with the aristocracy of people like the Lees. Uh, he was loved by Robert E. Lee anyway, though. At the Battle of Antietam in 1862, Robert E. Lee was just about to be overrun and possibly captured when A.P. Hill rushed his troops all the way from Harper's Ferry to Sharpsburg just in time to save Robert E. Lee. And Lee never forgot that. A.P. Hill, unfortunately, is not going to live out the war. In 1865, in just the last week of the war, he's going to be commanding some troops. He's going to get too close to some Union troops, and he'll be shot off his horse. Friends of Robert E. Lee, people who were with him, reported that this was the only time they saw Robert E. Lee cry. But when he was informed of A.P. Hill's death, they claimed that Robert E. Lee cried at that news. Now, a character who's missing through much of this book but then shows up is Major General Jeb Stuart. Now, Jeb is his nickname. His name is not Jeb. It's James Ewell Brown Stuart, which is a mouthful. But because his initials spell Jeb, he got that nickname. He is not only a very flamboyant cavalry commander in the South, but he sports probably one of the most flamboyant beards you're ever going to see. Anyway, in the early days of the war, Confederate cavalry was far superior to Northern cavalry, and that's probably because the South was an agrarian country. The North was industrial. And every time the cavalry was in play, Jeb Stuart's cavalry just kind of like rode all over the enemy, not literally, of course, but figuratively. He was also a really good of Robert E. Lee's son, and he was, in fact, loved by Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee called him a boy all the time, even though Jeb Stuart was 30 years old by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. He had a reputation for embarrassing the Federal Army, but, here's the big but, and this plays into the Killer Angels. Just a few weeks before in Virginia, at a place called Brandy Station, a cavalry battle took place. It was between the Union cavalry and the Southern cavalry. It was the largest cavalry battle ever to take place in the Western Hemisphere. And it was a standoff. It was not a victory for the Confederates. It was not a victory for the Union. But just because it was a standoff, it was a bit of a black mark on the reputation of Jeb Stuart. And by the way, if you go to the battlefield at Brandy Station, you'll find some markers that have been put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy. They were a descendant group that had a strong reputation for manipulating the truth. And their markers say that Jeb Stuart fought a fantastic battle and won. But most historians will say that no, in fact, he did not win this battle. But it's possible that by the time of Gettysburg, Jeb Stuart's trying to repair his damaged reputation. And if you've gotten far enough in the book, you'll know that he's cut off from his own army. He went off trying to gather supplies and raid small towns and get his name in the newspaper. And when it's time to join up with his army, he finds that he let the entire Union army get between him and his army. And so he's not available to Robert E. Lee on the first or most of the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, when he does show up, he brings a supply train, a Union supply train with over 100 wagons full of goods. And he tells Robert E. Lee, I've brought you 100 wagons. Robert E. Lee says, and they are an impediment to me now. They're just going to get in the way and slow us down. At that point, I don't know if this is in the records or if it's just an apocryphal story, but Jeb Stuart pulled out his sword and held it out to Robert E. Lee as if he were going to surrender his command, to resign his position. And Robert E. Lee just looked at him and said, there is not time for that now. In other words, you screwed up, but I need you. And at Gettysburg, yeah, I forgot to mention this one thing. At Gettysburg, on the third day of the battle, which is going to be July 3rd, Jeb Stuart is going to fight another cavalry battle against Union cavalry. Once again, it's going to be a failure. Nothing is going to be accomplished through this battle, but it is the largest cavalry battle that ever took place in Pennsylvania. And it does not play into our novel at all. Mention it because I think we should look at some of the things that the author chose not to include. Jeb Stuart is not going to live another year. He's going to be killed during the Overland Campaign at the Battle of Yellow Tavern. All right, one of the most interesting characters you are going to come across in this novel is going to be Major General George Pickett. And you might know that name because on the third day of the battle, you probably remember from history class something which we often call Pickett's Charge. We'll talk about whether or not it should be called that or not, but Pickett is a division commander. A division was made up of 3 brigades in Longstreet's Corps. And they're important in this book because they arrive kind of late at the battle. Everybody else has been fighting. They arrive late, so why not put them in on the third day for this grand assault? But Pickett is an interesting kind of guy because as a character for a novelist, he wears perfumes, he curls his hair. There's a joke, I think the first time he comes around when Longstreet's nearby in the novel, I think Longstreet says, "Good God, George, what is that smell?" or something like that. And so it's good for characterization. You might notice as you read this novel too, there are some times where somebody says something about Abraham Lincoln and Pickett immediately jumps in and defends Abraham Lincoln. You might ask yourself, why is this Confederate soldier defending this guy people in the South absolutely hate? Well, it's because Pickett couldn't get into West Point without a recommendation, an endorsement from a politician. And the politician who gave his endorsement to Pickett happened to be a younger Abraham Lincoln. And so Pickett owes a little something. He would not have this position in the Army if it were not for Abraham Lincoln. Another aspect of Pickett that leads to good characterization is he's got a girlfriend at this time. She's young. He starts dating her when she's only 16 years old. Her name is LaSalle Corbell Pickett, but he just calls her Sally. And the men will make little jokes about Pickett and his girlfriend and things like that. Sally becomes important after the war because it's really Sally who, through sort of a public relations campaign, gets that grand assault named after her husband, that we call it Pickett's Charge. It should not be called that, but Sally made sure her husband did well. After the war, Pickett, he lives out his life as basically an insurance guy. He sold insurance. He was an executive for an insurance company. He did not go into politics like so many others did. And I don't want to do any spoilers here, but a few years after the war, Pickett had a meeting with Robert E. Lee and a friend, and after the meeting, Pickett was very quiet, and the friend said something like, why didn't you talk very much in the meeting? And Pickett just said, that man destroyed my division. Pickett still, after the war, was holding Lee responsible for what happened. Now, Pickett's also important because we're going to hear a lot from him, as well as his 3 brigade commanders, Kemper, Garnett, and Armistead. And anytime you're going to see those 3 or all 4 of them together, they're going to be talking about this idea of cause. And cause is something we're always going to spell with a capital C as we go through this book. Why were people fighting this war? And you'll find that while there were common causes, there were often a lot of personal reasons people were fighting. So every time you hear Pickett, Kemper, Garnett, and Armistead speaking together, and you work on that character packet, add some notes about their perspective of why am I fighting. So let's talk about those 3 brigade commanders. So the first one that we've got is going to be Richard Garnett. And Garnett is an interesting guy. Garnett was, well, actually, let me get them all we'll just put them all up here for you, and then we'll just go through and talk about these 3 guys. So Garnett was in command of the old Stonewall Brigade at the Battle of Kernstown in 1862 when he received an order from his commander, Stonewall Jackson. And again, another order that maybe wasn't quite clear. Maybe it got through in a way that Garnett misinterpreted it. but Garnet believed he was being ordered to withdraw from some high ground known as Sandy Ridge. And because he withdrew, Union troops were able to claim that high ground, and the Battle of Kernstown became the only loss that Stonewall Jackson ever had as an independent commander. After the battle was over, Stonewall Jackson brought Garnet up on charges. He was court-martialing him for disobeying orders and causing this great embarrassment. Well, in those days, a man's honor was everything. And if somebody like Stonewall Jackson accuses you of disobedience or cowardice, you need to defend your honor. And that would have been done in the court-martial. Unfortunately for Garnet, Stonewall Jackson got himself killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and now Garnet has no way to ever defend himself in an argument against a dead person. So Michael Shaara is going to pick up on this, and he's going to take the idea that Richard Brooke Garnet believes that the only way he can now gain back his honor is to die in battle. And so this is a man who's coming into Gettysburg in our novel, bent on dying in battle. By the way, this image that I have, this photograph, is probably Garnet. This is an older picture, probably taken somewhere around the time of the war in Mexico. And it's often listed in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. as attributed to be Richard Brooke Garnet. So we're not 100% sure that this is Garnet. Now, James Kemper on the left of your screen, he was a former Speaker of the House of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Think about this. How many times have you ever seen a member of Congress in the United States, or even in the state legislature, resign a position to go fight in a war? They usually send other people to do that on their behalf. Kemper resigned to fight in the war. And then on the right, you have Louis Armistead. Armistead comes from a long military history. His father, his father's father, his father's father's father, they've all been soldiers. He's a bachelor at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, and that's sort of a sticking point. He had been a married man, but now he's a confirmed bachelor. He's one of the older, I think he might even be the oldest commander in Longstreet's corps, but he's definitely the oldest one in Pickett's division. And he happens to be friends with a Union soldier named Hancock, Winfield Scott Hancock. And the story goes, and you'll get this in the novel, that these two men had been together in California as part of the Mexican War in the years that followed, and they became very, very good friends. And when the war came, this is that brother against brother kind of concept. One of them went to fight for his home state, which was Pennsylvania, and another one went to fight for his home state, which was not really Virginia. Well, it was Virginia. It was Virginia. Armistead's buried in Maryland. I'm not even going to get into that, but to fight for the South. And they're going to find themselves across the field facing off against each one facing off against their good friends. So we'll get to more of that as we get through the novel. All right, then we've got A.P. Hill's division. We're not going to go into as much detail because we don't see much of these characters. But at the beginning of the book, you know Henry Heath. He was given orders, that came down from Lee, do not start a battle until we can get the army there. And Henry Heath started the battle and then came up with that explanation that I heard there were shoes in the town and we went to get those shoes. And for many years, that was the accepted explanation of how a battle at Gettysburg started. It's really kind of ridiculous when you look back now. Gettysburg was a small town of fewer than 3,000 people, and the Confederate Army had been going through that town for the better part of a month. They had barely enough shoemakers in the town to make shoes for their own people, let alone to have a huge supply. And Gettysburg is not a depot. The railroad into Gettysburg is still being built at this time. And so it's not a place where we're keeping, large supplies of things. Is it possible there was a rumor? Yeah, I suppose so. But most historians today say that Henry Heath sort of invented that story about the shoes in order to protect his own reputation. And then you have Dorsey Pender. And we don't see much of Dorsey Pender at all, except some men are talking about the letter that Dorsey Pender has recently received from his wife. Uh, she supported him completely, a very religious woman, when he was leading the Confederates to defend the Confederacy. But she wrote him a letter and actually said in this letter, now that you've invaded the North, that's an aggressive move. That's not what God would want, and I can no longer pray for you. Imagine being a soldier in war who receives a letter from your wife that says, I can no longer pray for you. And so he believes he's going to die in battle. And indeed, he is going to die in battle. Now, they get replaced. Heath is going to be replaced by a guy by the name of Johnston Pettigrew, and Pender's going to be replaced by a guy by the name of Isaac Trimble. They're not terribly important to us as far as plot or anything in the story goes, except that I want you to keep in mind a more proper name for that thing called Pickett's Charge would be to call it the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble Charge, because Pickett is commanding a division, and we've got Heath and Trimble doing the same thing, and so I just mention it because it would have been the Pickett-Heath-Pender assault otherwise. All right, and then some other characters you come across, they come in and out of our story as we're going along. You'll meet Jubal Early. Jubal Early has a reputation for being a really grouchy man with a bad temper. In fact, Robert E. Lee used to refer to him as my bad old man. And then we've got, there we go. There we've got Edward Porter Alexander. He's pretty young, but he's in charge of all of the Confederate artillery at Gettysburg. He rises to a really important position in the Army by the end of the war, but you're going to see him on the third day. You've already met Moxley Sorrell. Moxley Sorrell is Longstreet's aide-de-camp. He's basically working as sort of a bookkeeper, secretary, taking care of all those kind of paper needs. Moxley Sorrell comes from a very wealthy, well-educated family. He's erudite, upper class, sometimes looks down on others in the book. And then we've also got John Bell Hood. John Bell Hood is on the second day of the battle. He's going to challenge an order that he receives from Longstreet. Longstreet cannot rescind the order because Longstreet received the order from Lee. Hood is forced to go into battle in an attack that he knows he cannot win. He's going to be wounded and lose the use of his arm for the rest of his life. Even though his name is John Bell Hood, his nickname is Sam. Yeah, I don't understand some of these nicknames, but Sam Hood, you'll see him represented as throughout the book. After the Battle of Gettysburg, he comes back and he continues to command. In fact, he's going to be in command of the Confederate Army at Atlanta in 1864 when Sherman comes in, takes the city, and burns Atlanta to the ground. Then you have Harrison, Henry Thomas Harrison. I don't think his full name appears anywhere in the book. Harrison was an actor before the war, and he works as a spy. Robert E. Lee doesn't like the idea of using spies, and so he's forced to use him at Gettysburg because Jeb Stuart is missing. And so he's forced to rely on information from this spy, but Robert E. Lee always calls him a scout in the book. Harrison brings some very important information here to Longstreet. He continues as a spy after the Battle of Gettysburg, but he settles down. He marries a woman, and he settles down in New York State in the North, where, living as a civilian, he can write letters and send them south. His services as a spy are never going to be, again, as great as they are to the Confederacy than they are at the Battle of Gettysburg. And then there's Arthur Freemantle. Arthur Freemantle is a lieutenant colonel in Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards, and just to clear up one thing, in the novel, Michael Shaara has us believing that Freemantle has come as a representative of the Queen. He's looking to see if the Confederates have a chance and to then advise her on whether or not the British should come into the war on the side of the South. In reality, Freemantle was a soldier. He was sort of on vacation. He was touring the country at the time, and as a soldier, he followed the armies and went to see what their battle strategies were and what things were like. And So he was with the Confederates for a short time at Gettysburg. After the battle was over, he was given a pass. He actually passed through Union lines with that pass because he's not fighting, he's neutral. Went off to New York, and eventually he went back to England, where he wrote a book. And in that book, he predicted a certain win for the Confederate Army. And that book was published only weeks before the Confederate Army lost the war. All right, well, that's it again. That's our Confederate characters. Make sure you take a look in Schoology in case there are other assignments that go with this presentation. Again, I know these introductory presentations are long, and I thank you for staying with me through the whole thing.